You know, sometimes the truth about our heroes isn't found in the headlines or the hit records. Sometimes it's hidden in the quiet moments, in the relationships that history tried to forget, and in the voices that were silenced for far too long. For decades, we've heard the official story of John Lennon, the genius, the activist, the man who sang about peace and love. But there's another story, one that involved a woman whose name has been whispered but never truly heard, and a son who waited a lifetime to speak his truth. At 62 years old, Julian Lennon has finally broken his silence about May Pang, and what he's revealed changes everything we thought we knew about the Lennon family legacy. This isn't just another celebrity gossip story. This is about a young boy who lost his father, a woman who tried to bridge an impossible divide, and the complicated truth behind one of music's most iconic families. So, buckle up, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about John Lennon, Yoko Ono, and the real story behind the so-called Lost Weekend. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand Julian's silence and why he's breaking it now, you need to understand what it was like being John Lennon's forgotten son. Julian Charles Buchanan Lennon was born on April 8, 1963, at a time when his father was on the cusp of global superstardom. But unlike the fairy tale you might imagine, Julian's childhood wasn't filled with music and magic. It was filled with absence. John Lennon, despite all his public declarations of love and peace, was largely absent from his first son's life. The man who would later become a house husband to his second son, Sean, was, by his own admission, a terrible father to Julian. And this wasn't just occasional absence we're talking about. This was systemic neglect, the kind that leaves scars that last a lifetime. When John met Yoko Ono in 1966, everything changed. Julian was just 3 years old when his parents' marriage began to crumble, and by the time he was 5, his father had left for good. The man who sang, "All You Need Is Love," couldn't seem to find enough love for the child who called him Dad. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about something that's often glossed over in Beatles history. John Lennon's relationship with Julian wasn't just distant. It was painful, complicated, and at times cruel. Julian himself has spoken about this with remarkable candor over the years, describing his father as a hypocrite who could preach peace and love to the world but couldn't show it to his own family. Imagine being that child, watching your father become a global icon, while you're left wondering why you weren't enough to make him stay. The psychological impact of that kind of rejection is profound, and it shaped Julian in ways that would take decades to process and heal. John's departure wasn't a clean break either. It was messy, public, and accompanied by a new relationship that seemed to consume all of John's attention and energy. Yoko Ono became not just John's partner, but his entire world. And in that world, there didn't seem to be much room for the son from his previous life. For years after John and Cynthia's divorce, Julian had minimal contact with his father. The phone calls were rare, the visits even rarer. When they did happen, they were often awkward, strained encounters between a father who didn't quite know how to be a dad and a son who was desperate for any crumb of attention. Julian later described how he would wait by the phone hoping his father would call, only to be disappointed time and time again. The emotional toll of this rejection was devastating for a young boy trying to understand why his father's love seemed so conditional, so out of reach. And then, just when it seemed like John had moved on completely, creating a new life with Yoko in New York, something unexpected happened. Something that would change Julian's life in ways he's only now beginning to fully articulate. That something was May Pang. To understand May Pang's significance in this story, you need to understand who she was and how she came into the Lennon orbit. May Pang was a young Chinese-American woman from New York who started working as a personal assistant to John and Yoko in 1970. She was smart, capable, and efficient, exactly the kind of person the Lennons needed to help manage their increasingly complex lives. For 3 years, May worked closely with both John and Yoko, earning their trust and becoming an integral part of their daily operations. She was there for the recording sessions, the business meetings, the quiet moments at home. She saw the John Lennon that the public didn't see. Not the mythical peace activist or the rock god, but the real person with all his contradictions, insecurities, and complications. And what she saw during those years gave her a unique perspective on John's life, his marriage, and most importantly for our story, his relationship with his son. In 1973, John and Yoko's marriage hit a crisis point. The details of what led to their separation have been debated and discussed for decades, but what's undeniable is that Yoko made a decision that would shock most people. She essentially gave John permission to have an affair, and she specifically chose who that affair would be with. That person was May Pang. Now, let that sink in for a moment. Yoko Ono, John's wife, instructed their young assistant to begin a romantic relationship with her husband. It sounds like something out of a bizarre Hollywood script, but it's exactly what happened. May herself has described being uncomfortable with this arrangement at first. She was 23 years old, working for two people she admired and respected, and suddenly she was being told to become romantically involved with one of them. But Yoko was insistent, and so began what John would later call his lost weekend. 18 months that would prove to be some of the most productive, creative, and yes, happy months of John Lennon's life. The term lost weekend actually comes from a 1945 film about alcoholism, and John's choice of this name has always been interesting because it suggests chaos, regret, and time wasted. But the reality of those 18 months tells a very different story. Yes, there was drinking. Yes, there were wild parties and rock and roll excess. But there was also incredible creativity. During this period, John recorded 2 albums, Walls and Bridges and Rock and Roll, that showcased some of his best post-Beatles work. He reconnected with Paul McCartney and played on some of his recording sessions. He collaborated with other musicians, wrote songs, and seemed to rediscover his love of music without the heavy weight of being John and Yoko pressing down on him. And most importantly for our story, he reconnected with his son Julian. This is where May Pang's role becomes absolutely crucial, and it's why Julian's recent statements about her are so significant. You see, May Pang did something that no one else in John's life had done in years. She encouraged him to be a father to Julian. She didn't just encourage it, she actively facilitated it. According to multiple accounts, including Julian's own words, May was the driving force behind John reaching out to his first family. She convinced John to call Cynthia. She helped arrange for Julian to visit. She made sure their apartment had a bedroom ready for Julian when he came to stay. She planned activities that John and Julian could do together. In essence, May Pang became the bridge between John Lennon the icon and John Lennon the father. She saw that this brilliant, complicated, troubled man had unfinished business with his son, and she made it her mission to help heal that relationship. And here's what makes this so remarkable. She did all this knowing that she was a temporary fixture in John's life, knowing that Yoko was still very much in picture, and knowing that her own relationship with John was built on an unstable foundation. Julian himself has been remarkably generous in his descriptions of May and what she meant to him during that crucial period. In interviews for the documentary, The Lost Weekend, a love story, which chronicles May and John's relationship, Julian spoke about how different his father was when he was with May. He said, and I quote, "When Dad was with May, he always seemed very happy and youthful. She brought a light to our relationship." Think about what that statement reveals. This is a son who had spent years feeling rejected, abandoned, and unimportant to his father, and suddenly, because of one woman's efforts, he got to experience something he'd been craving his entire life, a relationship with his dad. May brought them to Disney World together. She organized trips to Montauk. She made sure Julian felt welcome in their home. She did all the things that a caring adult does when they want a child to feel loved and valued. And for Julian, who had spent so much of his childhood feeling neither loved nor valued by his father, this was transformative. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, and where Julian's recent decision to finally speak openly about May takes on deeper significance. During those 18 months of the Lost Weekend, May and John weren't just in a casual affair. They fell in love. Real, genuine, lasting love. They talked about buying a house together. They made plans for a future that included Julian as a regular presence in their lives. May has described how they found a property in Montauk that they both loved, a Scottish-style house that they imagined making their home. They were in the process of trying to purchase it when everything fell apart. In early 1975, John went back to Yoko, and the Lost Weekend came to an abrupt end. The reasons for John's return have been much debated. Some say Yoko used hypnotherapy on John, though this has never been confirmed. Others point to John's complicated psychology and his dependence on strong women in his life. Whatever the reason, John went back to the Dakota, back to Yoko, and May Pang was written out of the official story. And this is where the real tragedy begins, because what happened after John returned to Yoko had devastating consequences for Julian. The access that May had fought so hard to establish between father and son was suddenly cut off. The phone calls stopped. The visits ended. Julian went from finally having some semblance of a relationship with his father to being shut out again. Only this time it was worse because now he knew what was possible. He'd experienced what it was like to have his father's attention, to spend time with him, to feel like he mattered, and then it was all taken away. Multiple sources, including Julian himself, have suggested that Yoko actively worked to limit John's contact with his first family after he returned. Whether this was out of insecurity, jealousy, a desire to focus John's attention on their soon-to-be-born son, Sean, or some combination of all these factors, the result was the same. Julian was pushed to the margins of his father's life once again. For Julian, this second abandonment may have been even more painful than the first, because now he knew it didn't have to be this way. He'd seen that his father was capable of being present, engaged, and loving when given the right environment and support. May Pang had proven that. But in the world of John and Yoko, there was no room for the past. And Julian represented that past in a way that seemed to make Yoko uncomfortable. The last 5 years of John's life, from 1975 to 1980, were spent as a house husband, dedicating himself completely to raising Sean and supporting Yoko's career. It's a beautiful story of transformation and second chances, except for the part where John's first son was left out in the cold, watching from a distance as his father became the parent to Sean that he'd never been to Julian. The hypocrisy of this wasn't lost on Julian, and he's spoken about it in interviews over the years, noting the painful irony of his father's transformation into a devoted dad for his second son while remaining largely absent for his first. When John was murdered in December 1980, Julian was 17 years old. He hadn't seen his father in years. Their relationship was unresolved, complicated, and painful. And suddenly, any chance of fixing it was gone forever. The grief Julian experienced wasn't just for the loss of a father. It was for the loss of what might have been, for all the conversations they never had, for all the reconciliation that would now never happen. And in the aftermath of John's death, the official narrative began to solidify. The story of the world was told was John and Yoko's story, a great love affair between two artistic souls. May Pang was dismissed as a footnote, a lost weekend indiscretion that John himself had minimized in later interviews. The role she played in trying to heal John's relationship with Julian was erased from the official history. And Julian, still processing his grief and loss, wasn't in a position to challenge any of this. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't stay buried forever. For decades, May Pang has maintained her version of events, insisting that what she shared with John was real love, not just a drunken interlude. She's written books, given interviews, and most recently, produced a documentary that tells her side of the story. And throughout all of this, she's been consistent in one crucial claim, that she tried to help John be a better father to Julian, and that during their time together, she succeeded. For years, people dismiss her claims as the wishful thinking of a woman trying to inflate her importance in a famous man's life. But then Julian started speaking, and everything changed. Because Julian, who has every reason to protect his father's legacy and every incentive to align with the official Yoko-approved narrative, has instead chosen to validate May's account. And that's huge. In the documentary The Lost Weekend, A Love Story, which premiered in 2023, Julian appears to share his memories of that crucial period in his life. His participation in the film was significant because Julian has generally been very private about his feelings regarding his father and has been diplomatic in his public statements about Yoko. But in this documentary, he speaks with an honesty that's both refreshing and heartbreaking. He talks about how May made him feel welcome. He describes a happiness he saw in his father when he was with May. He acknowledges the stark contrast between the access he had to his father during the Lost Weekend and the limited contact he had before and after. By appearing in this documentary and speaking positively about May, Julian was doing something revolutionary. He was challenging the official narrative that had been carefully constructed around his father's life and legacy. But it's in 2025, at the age of 62, that Julian has really started to open up about May and what she meant to him. Recent interviews and social media posts suggest that Julian has been reflecting deeply on his childhood, his father, and the people who tried to help him during those difficult years. And May Pang keeps coming up in these reflections as someone who deserves recognition for her efforts. In an age where Julian could easily ignore May or downplay her significance to maintain peace with Yoko and the Lennon estate, he's instead chosen to speak the truth about what May did for him. That takes courage, especially when you consider the power dynamics at play. Yoko Ono controlled John Lennon's estate and legacy. Julian has had to fight for years just to get fair treatment regarding his father's wealth and the use of Beatles songs. Speaking positively about a woman whom Yoko has tried to minimize and erase from history could have consequences for Julian's already complicated relationship with his father's widow. So why is Julian speaking out now? There are probably multiple reasons, but they all seem to come down to a fundamental need to honor the truth, regardless of how inconvenient that truth might be for the official story. At 62, Julian is older now than his father ever got to be. He's had decades to process his childhood trauma, his father's absence, and the complicated legacy he inherited. He's done the therapy, the reflection, the hard work of forgiveness. And part of that work seems to involve acknowledging the people who try to help him, even when doing so wasn't convenient or easy for them. May Pang was one of those people. She didn't have to care about a lonely 10-year-old boy. She could have focused solely on her relationship with John and ignored the complicated reality of his first family. But she didn't. She saw a child who needed his father, and she tried to make that connection happen. For Julian, honoring that effort now seems to be part of his own healing journey. There's also a broader context to Julian's decision to speak out. In recent years, there's been a growing pushback against the sanitized version of John Lennon's life that's been promoted by Yoko and the Lennon estate. People are starting to ask uncomfortable questions about John's treatment of his first family, about Yoko's role in limiting Julian's access to his father, and about the narratives that have been constructed around one of rock's most iconic figures. The Me Too movement and broader conversations about power, control, and truth-telling have created a cultural environment where it's more acceptable to challenge official stories and speak uncomfortable truths. Julian's decision to be honest about May's role in his life is part of this larger reckoning with difficult truths about famous men and the families they left behind. But let's dig deeper into what exactly Julian has been saying about May, because the specifics matter. In interviews, Julian has consistently described May as someone who brought light and happiness into his father's life during a crucial period. He's talked about how different John was when he was with May. More relaxed, more available, more like the father Julian had always wanted. He's described specific memories, like trips to Disney World and time spent together in their apartment, moments that stand out in Julian's memory precisely because they were so rare in his relationship with his father. But beyond just pleasant memories, Julian has also acknowledged a bigger picture of what May was trying to do. He's recognized that May was actively working to maintain and strengthen his relationship with John at a time when almost everyone else in John's life seemed content to let that relationship wither. Julian has also been remarkably forthright about what happened after his father returned to Yoko. While he's been careful not to directly attack Yoko, something that would only create more conflict and drama, he's been clear that his access to his father was severely limited after John went back to the Dakota. The contrast he draws between the lost weekend period and the years that followed is stark and damning. It suggests that given the right partner and environment, John Lennon was capable of being a good father to Julian, but that in the environment created by his reunion with Yoko, that fatherhood was no longer a priority. This is a devastating indictment, even though Julian presents it in measured, thoughtful terms. It suggests that the official story of John's transformation into a dedicated house husband is incomplete at best and misleading at worst. Yes, John became a devoted father to Sean, but only by completely shutting out his first son in the process. And here's where May Pang's story becomes even more significant. May has long maintained that she and John remained in contact even after he went back to Yoko. She shared that John would call her, sometimes late at night, and that his last words to her during one of those calls were, "You know I still love you." She suggested that John's return to Yoko wasn't a complete reconciliation, and happily ever after that the official story suggests that John had doubts and regrets about the choice he'd made. For years, people dismissed these claims as the fantasies of a woman who couldn't let go. But Julian's recent statements lend credibility to May's version of events. If John truly was happier and more engaged as a father when he was with May, if that period really was as positive and productive as both May and Julian described, then it raises serious questions about why John went back to Yoko and what he sacrificed when he made that choice. One of the things he sacrificed, it seems clear, was his relationship with Julian. Now, I want to be careful here because this story isn't about demonizing Yoko Ono or turning this into a simplistic tale of the good woman versus the bad woman. That would be both unfair and inaccurate. Yoko is a brilliant artist in her own right, and her relationship with John was clearly meaningful and important to him. But that doesn't mean we can't acknowledge the negative impact that relationship had on John's first family, particularly on Julian. One of the most troubling aspects of the John and Yoko story is how completely John seemed willing to erase his past once he was with Yoko. It's as if his life before Yoko didn't matter, as if the people from that time, including his own son, were disposable. And whether that impulse came from John himself or was encouraged by Yoko or some combination of both, the result was the same. Julian was left out in the cold, collateral damage in the great love story of John and Yoko. May Pang represents a road not taken, an alternative timeline where maybe things could have been different. During those 18 months, John was reconnecting not just with Julian, but with other parts of his past. He spent time with Paul McCartney, healing some of the wounds from the Beatles' breakup. He collaborated with other musicians from his pre-Yoko days. He seemed to be finding a balance between his past and his present, integrating the different parts of his life rather than completely cutting off one to embrace the other. May facilitated that integration. She didn't ask John to forget his past or pretend it didn't exist. She encouraged him to embrace it, including the son he'd neglected. But when John went back to Yoko, that integration stopped. The past was once again cordoned off, accessible only in controlled doses if at all. For Julian, watching this happen must have been agonizing. There's another layer to this story that's worth exploring, and it has to do with how May Pang has been treated by the official keepers of the Lennon legacy. May has been pretty vocal over the years about feeling erased from John's history, about watching as The Lost Weekend was minimized and her role in John's life was dismissed. The documentary The Lost Weekend, a love story, is in many ways her attempt to reclaim her place in this history, to insist that what she shared with John mattered and was real, and she's faced significant pushback for doing so. She's been accused of trying to profit from her connection to John, of exaggerating the importance of their relationship, of not being able to move on. But here's the thing. The evidence supports May's version of events. The music John made during that period, the photographs May took, the testimony of people who were around at the time, and most importantly, Julian's own words all corroborate what May has been saying for decades. This wasn't just a meaningless fling. This was a significant relationship that had real consequences for everyone involved. Julian's willingness to validate May's account is therefore hugely significant. He's essentially saying, my father's official biographers got it wrong. The woman they've dismissed as a temporary distraction actually played a crucial role in my life and in my father's life. By doing so, Julian is insisting on a more complete, honest accounting of his father's legacy, one that includes the uncomfortable truths alongside the inspiring mythology. This is what makes Julian's recent statements so powerful. He's not interested in protecting a sanitized version of his father's life. He's interested in the truth, even when that truth is complicated and messy. And the truth is that John Lennon was a complicated man who could be both brilliant and cruel, visionary and neglectful, capable of great love and terrible indifference, often toward the same people. For those of us who have grown up with John Lennon's music and message, these revelations can be uncomfortable. We want our heroes to be heroes, uncomplicated and pure. We want the man who sang Imagine to have lived according to those ideals in every aspect of his life. But real people don't work that way. John Lennon was a deeply flawed man who struggled with demons he never fully conquered. His treatment of Julian is one of the most troubling aspects of his legacy, a reminder that artistic genius doesn't automatically translate to moral excellence or personal integrity. But acknowledging John's failures doesn't mean we have to stop appreciating his music or his message. It just means we have to hold multiple truths at once, that someone can create beauty and meaning through their art while simultaneously causing pain and damage in their personal life. And this is where May Pang's story becomes almost redemptive. Here was someone who saw John's failure as a father and tried to fix it. She didn't have to do that. She could have enjoyed her relationship with one of the most famous men in the world and ignored the complicated reality of his family situation. But she didn't. She saw a wrong and tried to right it. She saw a child who needed his father, and a father who needed to be connected to his child, and she worked to make that connection happen. That's not the behavior of someone looking to take advantage of a famous man. That's the behavior of someone who genuinely cared about doing the right thing. And yet, for decades, May has been maligned and dismissed by people who would rather maintain a comfortable myth than acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. Julian's recent statements are a repudiation of that dismissal. They're a recognition that May deserves credit for what she tried to do, even if ultimately she couldn't save John from himself or protect Julian from being hurt again. Looking at the bigger picture, Julian's decision to break his silence about May at age 62 seems to be part of a broader reckoning he's having with his father's legacy and his own life. Julian has had a successful career as a musician and photographer in his own right, but he's always lived in the shadow of his father's towering fame. For years, he was defined primarily as John Lennon's son, rather than as an artist in his own right. He's spoken about how difficult it was to pursue music when comparisons to his father were inevitable and usually unfavorable. He's talked about the burden of carrying the Lennon name and all the expectations and complications that come with it. But at 62, Julian seems to have reached a point where truth matters more than keeping the peace. He's lived his entire life in the shadow of his father's choices, his father's failures, and his father's mythology. He's spent decades processing the pain of abandonment, the confusion of conflicted love, and the burden of a complicated legacy. And now, finally, he's in a position to speak his truth without apology or qualification. The silence he's breaking isn't just about May Pang. It's about everything. The absent father, the painful childhood, the alternative narratives that were suppressed, the people who were written out of the story, and the complicated reality that exists behind every carefully constructed public image. By breaking this silence, Julian is reclaiming his own story and insisting that his experience matters just as much as the official version of events. So what does all this tell us? What should we take away from Julian's decision to finally speak openly about May Pang and her role in his life? First and foremost, it's a reminder that official histories are always incomplete and often deliberately misleading. The story we've been told about John Lennon's life has been carefully curated to emphasize certain elements while minimizing others. May Pang's role in John's life and her efforts to reconnect him with Julian have been systematically downplayed because they don't fit the narrative that Yoko and the Lennon estate want to promote. But Julian's testimony, along with May's own account and the documentary evidence that supports both of them, tells us that this official history is missing crucial pieces. May Pang wasn't just a footnote in John's life. She was a significant partner during a crucial period, and her impact on John and Julian's relationship was profound. Second, Julian's statements are a reminder of the complicated reality of family, especially celebrity families, where public image often takes precedence over private truth. The Lennon family story is messy, painful, and full of conflicting loyalties and unresolved tensions. Julian has had to navigate this complexity his entire life. Try to honor his father's memory, while also being honest about the pain John caused. His willingness to speak positively about May, even when doing so complicates the official narrative, shows a commitment to truth over convenience. It shows that Julian has decided that getting the story right matters more than maintaining a comfortable myth. Third, this story is a reminder of the importance of the people who try to do the right thing even when it's difficult. May Pang saw that John needed to be connected to his son, and she worked to make that happen even though she had no obligation to do so. She could focus solely on her own relationship with John and ignored Julian entirely. But she didn't. She saw a child who needed his father and a father who needed to be reminded of his responsibilities. And she tried to bridge that gap. That's admirable, and it deserves to be recognized. Fourth, Julian's recent statement highlights the ongoing struggle to control narratives and legacies, especially after someone dies. Once John was murdered, Yoko took control of his estate and his story. She's been the gatekeeper of the Lennon legacy for over 40 years, deciding what gets emphasized and what gets minimized, who gets included in the story, and who gets written out. May Pang is just one example of how this gatekeeping works. By dismissing May as a lost weekend indiscretion, Yoko has tried to minimize her importance and erase her contributions. But Julian's testimony disrupts that effort. It insists that May's role was significant and deserves to be acknowledged. It challenges Yoko's monopoly on the Lennon story and opens up space for alternative narratives that are truer to what actually happened. Fifth, this story is ultimately about the long shadow that parental abandonment casts over a child's life. Julian is 62 years old, and he's still processing the impact of his father's choices. He's still working through the pain of rejection, still trying to understand why his father couldn't show him the love and attention he deserved, still grappling with the legacy of being John Lennon's forgotten son. The fact that he's now speaking openly about May Pang suggests that part of his healing involves acknowledging the people who try to help him, even when their efforts ultimately couldn't change the fundamental dysfunction of his relationship with his father. May couldn't fix John's failings as a father, but she tried, and for Julian, that effort matters. It matters enough that at 62, he's willing to speak the truth about it, regardless of how that truth might be received by the Lennon estate, by Beatles fans, or by anyone else who's invested in a different version of the story. There's also something profound about the timing of Julian's decision to speak out. We're living in an era where we're re-examining the legacies of famous men, asking harder questions about their private behavior, and refusing to let artistic achievement excuse personal failings. The revelations about abusive behavior by men in entertainment, politics, and other fields have created a cultural moment where it's more acceptable to speak uncomfortable truths about powerful men, even beloved ones. John Lennon is not exempt from this reckoning. For too long, his treatment of Julian was overlooked or excused because of his musical genius and his peace activism. But increasingly, people are asking, what good is preaching peace and love to the world if you can't show it to your own child? Julian's recent statements about May Pang fit into this larger cultural conversation about truth, legacy, and accountability. It's also worth noting how May Pang herself has responded to Julian's recent support. By all accounts, she's deeply grateful for his willingness to validate her story and acknowledge her efforts on his behalf. For decades, May has maintained her version of events in the face of significant pushback and criticism. She's been accused of living in the past, of trying to profit from her connection to John, of exaggerating her importance in his life. But she's never wavered in her insistence that what she shared with John was real and meaningful, and that she tried to do right by Julian. To have Julian now publicly confirm her account must feel like vindication after years of being dismissed and marginalized. It's a reminder that sometimes the truth does eventually come out, even if it takes decades. As we think about Julian's decision to break his silence about May Pang, we also need to consider what this means for how we understand John Lennon and his legacy. John Lennon was many things: a musical genius, a cultural icon, a peace activist, a complicated and flawed human being. His treatment of Julian is one of the darkest aspects of his story, a reminder that personal behavior doesn't always match public principles. But the May Pang chapter offers a glimpse of what might have been, a period when John seemed to be finding his way toward being a better father, reconnected with his son, integrating the different parts of his life. That it didn't last, that John ultimately went back to Yoko and once again marginalized Julian, makes the story tragic rather than redemptive. But knowing that there was a moment when things were better, when John was present and engaged as a father, at least gives us a sense of his capacity for change, even if that capacity was never fully realized. Julian Lennon's decision at age 62 to finally break his silence about May Pang is significant on multiple levels. It's a personal statement about honoring someone who tried to help him during a difficult time. It's a challenge to the official narrative that has dominated Beatles history for decades. It's a contribution to the broader cultural conversation about truth, legacy, and accountability. And it's a reminder that family stories, especially celebrity family stories, are always more complicated than the official version suggests. The simple story we were told, John and Yoko's great love affair, leaves out so much, including the son who was abandoned, the girlfriend who tried to heal a family, and the complicated reality of a man who could write beautiful songs about love, but struggled to show that love to the people who needed it most. In the end, Julian's statements about May Pang are an act of truth-telling and an act of grace. Truth-telling because he's insisting on a more complete, honest accounting of his father's life and his own childhood. Grace because he's choosing to focus on the positive impact made rather than dwelling on the negative impact of others. He could use this platform to attack Yoko, to air grievances to settle scores. But instead, he's chosen to honor someone who showed him kindness, who tried to help him, who saw his pain and attempted to alleviate it even when doing so wasn't easy or convenient for her. That a powerful message about choosing gratitude over resentment, about acknowledging the good even amidst so much difficulty, about finding the light even in a story that has so much darkness. For those of us who have followed the Beatles story for years, who have loved John Lennon's music and been inspired by his message, Julian's recent revelations are both challenging and important. They challenge us to see John more completely, not just as a musical genius and peace activist, but as the flawed father who hurt his son. They challenge the simple narratives we've been told and insist on a more nuanced, complicated truth. But they also remind us that even in difficult, dysfunctional families, there are people who try to do the right thing, who work to heal rather than harm, who see pain and try to alleviate it. May Pang was one of those people. She couldn't ultimately save John from his demons or protect Julian from being hurt, but she tried, and that effort deserves to be remembered and honored. Julian Lennon has spent his entire life navigating the complicated legacy of being John Lennon's son. He's been the forgotten child, the abandoned son, the one who didn't fit into the official story. But at 62, he's found his voice and he's using it to tell his truth. That truth includes acknowledging May Pang and the role she played in his life. It includes challenging the narratives that have written her out of the story. And it includes insisting that his experience, his pain, and his memories matter just as much as the carefully constructed mythology of John and Yoko. In breaking his silence about May Pang, Julian Lennon is not just honoring one woman's efforts on his behalf. He's reclaiming his own story, insisting on the truth, and reminding us all that behind every public image, there's a more complicated reality that deserves to be told.